So MHS is an independent nonprofit organization. We do all of this through membership support. So if you enjoy this program and other programs, I hope you'll consider becoming a supporter or member of the organization. The main thing that MHS does is we are a major research library. We hold about 13 million manuscripts, which include the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents, so John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and John Quincy Adams. We also have a remarkable collection of material related to the American Revolution, the early Republic, 19th century families, and we continue collecting into the 20th and 21st century today. Today we have a program on the Boston Red Sox, and you may think that this has nothing to do with the American Revolution in our collection of papers, but you may be wrong. In our collections, we also have the papers of Benjamin Edes, a 18th century agitator, journalist, and newspaper publisher, who, among other things, was partially responsible for the beginning of the Boston Tea Party. Benjamin Edes is also noteworthy for being the ancestor of our moderator this afternoon, Gordon Edes. Our moderator, Gordon, is the team historian for the Boston Red Sox, a position that he's held since 2015. Before that, he covered the team for 18 years, from 1997 to 2015, first for the Boston Globe and then for ESPN. He will get up and introduce the rest of the panel and introduce us to the rest of the program. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Gordon. Thank you.
It's so funny when Gavin mentioned Benjamin Edes. I've always wondered if Benjamin Edes would be like spinning in his grave if he knew one of his descendants became a sports writer, And the other part is when Gavin said that, described Benjamin Edes as an agitator, it didn't take much imagination on my part to see Terry Francona sitting there going, yeah, Edes, agitator? Yeah, that's about right. So I'm really delighted that you came for what I think is a very special afternoon. I will admit my personal bias right out of the chute. The 1967 Red Sox are my favorite team of all time.
All right.
I mean, as with, I suspect, more than a few of you, the 67 Red Sox were right in my wheelhouse as a fan. I mean, what could be better to be 12 years old and watch that team, and particularly when you remember how low the expectations were for that team. And I'll tell you a little story. I was always reluctant to meet Earl Yastrzemski as a reporter because he had been such a larger-than-life figure for me as a fan, and I didn't want anything to ruin my image of him. And I heard that Yaz could be a little contentious. How's that? Does that work? Contentious work? So for years I avoided it. So I think what I did is I waited him out. I waited until he'd mellowed some, and then I introduced myself to him, and he was very gracious. But I couldn't help but think last night as we were doing the David Ortiz ceremony and retiring David's number 34 up on the facade, and Yaz, of course, came, and I just was wondering, was Yaz on Storrow Drive by the top of the second inning?
Sooner than that.
Yeah, sooner than that. Enough about me. Let me introduce the members of the panel. I'm going to start, we'll go from my left. Tom Whalen is professor at Boston University, has a book coming out in August on the 67 Red Sox. He's worked on it for a couple of years at least, right? And what sets Tom's book apart from the other books by the panelists that are here is that you also address the Cardinals. Those of us who love the 67 Red Sox, we try to forget that the season didn't end with Rico Petrocelli catching that little pop-up in short left field and Pandemonium on the field. We did have to play the World Series. The Cardinals, the Birdos, as they were popularly known in the title of Tom's book. So he gives us both sides of the story, which is pretty cool. The gentleman to his left is the man responsible for us all being here today. Personal story first about Frank O'Brien. So I get hired to cover the Red Sox in 1997, just before the start of the season. I was an outsider. I'd worked at the LA Times, I'd worked at the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, I'd worked at the Chicago Tribune. This is a very provincial area. I don't have to tell you guys that. You live here, you know. So I come to spring training, my first spring training down in Fort Myers, and didn't really know anybody, and I knew people were gunning for me. I was at the Globe, and I also was this outsider. Well, this man, Frank O'Brien, was still the sports photographer for the Boston Globe, assigned to the Red Sox. Frankie decided to make it his personal mission to take me under his wing, introduce me to everybody. Kid, you know, that might be a good story. That guy might be a good story. You might want to talk to him. He just made it so easy for me to jump into coverage of the club. At the time, the Red Sox front office wasn't exactly what we would call media friendly. I mean, those were the days of Dan Duquette and John Harrington. And my first week covering the club was the week that Roger Clemens signed as a free agent with Toronto. It's rain. I go out to Fenway Park that afternoon. I want to talk to Dan Duquette. It's raining. This is before cell phones. I'm at a payphone on the across the street on Jersey Street. Call the Red Sox PR guys. Hey Kev, can I talk to Duquette? No. Can I come inside? It's raining. No. So it was great that I had Frankie running interference for me. To his left is a gentleman that I've gotten to become very close friends with. His name is Herb Crehan. He's a Red Sox historian. If you ever get our Red Sox magazine during the season in spring training, Herb has written numerous features about Red Sox players, past and present. He's got a book out on the '67 Red Sox, and he's my unofficial co-historian on the Sox. And to his left is a gentleman who has probably written, if he ever did a word count, maybe he has. Have you ever done a word count?
No.
Okay. If he has, there's probably no one who has written more words about the Red Sox that have appeared in book form, ebook form, online bios than Bill Nowlin. He's just an amazing resource that we are so grateful that we're able to tap into the fruit of his work. As you see, baseball through the lens of a camera. Photography in sports has a long history. Going back to the very early years of our ball club. Does anybody recognize that man by any chance? Tris Speaker, way to go. Probably our first superstar. And in fact, everybody makes, belly aches about the Sox selling Ruth to the Yankees. Well, actually, Tris Speaker held out before the start of 16 season, spring training. Never imagined what was about to happen. They traded the guy in the prime of his career to the Cleveland Indians. He was 27 years old. He was shot. That actually caused more uproar in Boston than the subsequent sale of Ruth, although once Ruth became the Babe, that kind of changed. This is a classic photo which I chose to illustrate the relationship between baseball and photography. A famous baseball photographer named Charles Conlon took this picture. That's Ty Cobb sliding in at third, and you can see the ferocity of how Cobb played the game etched all over his face there. What would we do without, as a newspaper guy, I told you how much Frankie meant to my career, but the headline in that picture sells that story every bit as much, and I would argue more than the stories that accompany it. That was actually Babe Ruth coming back when he signed with the Boston Braves. Again, through the lens you know, it's more so, I would argue, than even television. You can capture the essence of a person through the lens. I mean, and what an epic photo there of a young Ted Williams. He doesn't appear to be looking with great affection at whoever's on the other end of the Of course, baseball has been a vehicle to tell more than the story of runs, hits, and errors. To the left in this photo is one of our most beloved figures, Johnny Pesky. We miss him every day, I can tell you that. And of course, he's with Senator Bobby Kennedy, who we also miss every day. Getting a little more current, Freddie Lynn, who just got named to the USC Hall of Fame, by the way. And Freddie is one of the few players who single-handedly changed the construction of Fenway Park. Does anybody know how and why? Yes, sir.
Added them to the back walls, right?
They added padding to the walls, and why? Yes, sir.
I think it was in the 6th game of the World Series.
Bingo.
Where he backed up and he didn't make the catch.
No.
I think Ken Griffey hit the ball.
That I don't remember.
Ken Griffey's senior.
Yes, very good. Touche. Good try. Yeah. So, of course, you know, we've had an opportunity, and Frank, you know, yes, this is about 67, but Frank, of course, came to know this gentleman very well, Roger Clemens. He was still around when this guy, and I maintain, from 1998 to 2000, this is the best pitcher I've ever seen and ever hope to see, Pedro Martinez. This guy, how did he get in here? Frankie did not take that picture. I'm thinking that pitch was a little bit low and away, high and outside. It wasn't a strike.
Yeah, to the right.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
All right.
And then, of course, the wonderful wind dance repeat of today. You know, Jackie Bradley Jr. doing his ski jump there. But that brings us back all the way around to this kid from Neponset, Massachusetts, who winds up in the summer of 1967 with one of the great photo assignments of all time. And you did not begin that season, Frank, covering the club. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
Tell us
right.
the story.
Well, what happened was, back in those days, you may remember, we had two papers. We had a morning paper and an evening paper. And about halfway through that season, the editors of the evening paper decided they were tired of getting the leftover photos from the morning paper. So they said, we want a full-time sports photographer for the evening paper. And for the next 25 years, I did nothing but sports. So, yeah.
And Frank, what were you doing at that point? I mean, how deep into were you a rookie that year?
I started at the Globe in '58. I worked in every department on the plant.
Okay.
I started running advertising copy around the streets of Boston as a messenger. And eventually in 1964, I went on the photo staff, and they told me I was going to go in the dark room and spend 2 years in the dark room, you learn the business from the inside out. Well, I had already learned the business from the inside out because I went out with the photographers every night. And they were a great bunch of guys, and they taught me the business. So I went down there, I was down there about 3 weeks, and the chief came up to me one day and says, I need a photographer to get on a Whalen to cover this woman's page assignment, believe it or not. That's what we call it, the woman's page. Women's page assignment. I go, okay, I'll go. And I was on the street every day after that. So, yeah, and for the first 2 years, I did general assignment. You know, whatever fell in my time frame,
Right.
4 to midnight. And then they made the offer on the sports job, and I took it. I was still working 4 to midnight. Except on the weekends. We played day games on the weekends.
Yeah. Frank, what was it like to be a photographer in that particular time and place? I mean, particularly when you compare it to, say, the access you get to athletes today.
Oh, it was totally different. I mean, we had, back in those days, we had total access to everything around the ball club. With any of the teams, not just the Red Sox, but all the pro teams in town, you had access to doing it. I mean, you saw in the pictures upstairs, I was in the trainer's room, I was on the team bus, in the airport with the guys, flew charters with them and all that. And that made the job so much easier because you had that access. And Now, there's none of that. All you ever see of the players is on the field, for the photographers, you know, so.
Do you think it helped that at that time anyway, that ball players weren't drawing 8-figure salaries and that there wasn't a huge gap between what, you know, the working reporters and photographers were making and what the ball players were making?
Yeah, back in those days, believe it or not, we were making about the same thing that they were. You know?
That's changed.
I don't
ladies
think
and
that's the
gentlemen.
case anymore. So yeah, and you know, and back then, 50 years ago, I was a contemporary there, so they kind of trusted me, you know, and they would tell me things. And they would tell me things they would never tell a writer. Never, believe me, because first of all, you develop a trust with them. After a couple of years, they understood that I was a photographer and I was good. Wasn't going to do anything to harm them. You know, I show what they do in the field. That's my job. But so they would tell me stories. It was great fun.
That team, one of the things that struck me about that club, and we're going to go into it a little bit more in depth, is how young that team was. So there were 18 guys in that roster who played for the Red Sox at least one game who were 25 years of age or younger. Yaz was 27.
Yeah.
That entire infield, I believe, was 24 and under. The fact that you were kind of roughly the same age as those guys, how much did that play into being able to develop relationships?
Oh
with
yeah,
them?
it was, you know, you're just a contemporary of theirs, and they trusted you, you know, and you just kind of hung with them back then. You don't hang with them now, God forbid, but yeah, you just hung around with them, and you know, because like you say, you're in the same age as them.
You know, one of the things that blew me away when I looked at Frank's photographs was that he had pictures of guys on the training room table, like, yes, you know, being worked on by Buddy LaRue. I mean, think about what it's like now. You know, when teams will announce that a guy has had an upper body injury or a lower body injury, and there's Frankie with his camera in the training room. How was that?
You didn't think anything of it. That's part of the access that I had. I had access to just about anything that they did. You know, I would sit with my elbows on the card table and kibitz with them before the games, you know. You couldn't imagine doing that today.
You couldn't.
No.
They'd escort you out of the clubhouse if you sat down at the table now.
If you went even past the door of the trainer's room, you'd be escorted out of the clubhouse.
Before we get into the meat of talking about 67, I just want to take the temperature of this room to see how intense we're talking about in terms of your knowledge of 67. So I'm going to quickly ask you a few questions. Just pop up a hand. Opening day second baseman, 1967. Yes, sir. Reggie Smith. Why? Do you remember? Yes, sir. Do you remember the injury? Lower body. Touche. Who said that? Yes. Yes.
Very good.
Bad bat. Very good. All right. Second question. April 14th, 1967. Friday afternoon, Yankee Stadium. Yes, sir. Well, that's an easy part of the question. Wow. That's an easy part of the question. I knew you guys knew something before you walked in here. All right, so a left-handed rookie pitcher from Toronto made its major league debut. Kid pitcher from Toronto knocking on the door of fame, as the famous Impossible Dream album said. His name, as this gentleman correctly informs us, was Billy Rohr, facing Whitey Ford in Yankee Stadium. Among the fans at that game were Jackie Kennedy Onassis and John Jr. So he takes a no-hitter into the ninth inning, as this gentleman also informed us. Elston Howard broke up the no-no with 2 outs in the ninth inning, soft single to right field. My question, top of the ninth, leadoff hitter for the Yankees, hits a drive deep to left center field. Yastrzemski went back and made a tremendous catch, one of the great catches of his career. Who hit the ball?
Tom Tresh.
Very good.
Wow.
Very good. I like it. These folks know their stuff. All right, we'll jump ahead. August, oh, what was the question? What was the score?
Yeah.
Do you know?
What was it? 3-0.
Thank you. I knew somebody here would know that.
You were just going to say that, right?
Yeah. No, I knew it. I had it written down. All right, August 20th, 1967. 2 days after Tony Conigliaro gets beamed on a Friday night here at Fenway. The Red Sox were losing 8-0 to the California Angels and came back to win the game 9-8. Can anybody tell me who hit the game-winning home run? Jerry Adair. Yes, sir. Very good. Very good. I'm impressed. All right, so I really don't have to ask any more questions. You guys obviously know your stuff. But one more. August 27th, Comiskey Park, Chicago. Game 1, doubleheader. 3-3 in the ninth. Fly ball hit to right field. Jose Tartabull makes a catch, throws home. Elston Howard leaps in the air, catches the ball, blocks the plate with his size 12 shoe, and this Chicago runner was out at the plate. Who was it? Ken Berry.
Let's cancel a question and answer. This is too tough.
So now, for bonus points, who hit the fly ball? Oh my God. Would you like to come up and moderate this, man? Very good. Wow. That's pretty good.
Here we were going to explain who won the World Series, and you know.
But my friend here, he had a topper, although some of you folks have already proved this wrong. He said that up until this afternoon, he had met only one person who could spell Yastrzemski correctly. But yeah, this crowd, yeah. This is a different crowd. And one quick aside on the Ken Berry story. So Herb and I were on a radio show last Saturday morning, and Rico Petrocelli was one of the hosts, right? And Rico tells us that he just ran into Ken Berry down in Florida, and Ken Berry, 50 years later, insists he was safe. Rico just laughed at him. So anyway, 1967, in so many ways, a watershed year, and not just at Fenway Park, and not just with the Red Sox. Tom, you kind of set the scene a little bit in your book as to where we were as a city, as a nation in 1967. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, well, when you think of 67, when we think about the 60s, really 67 is the first year of what we consider the 1960s, kind of like the cultural, political overview. This is where everything's beginning to come apart. That really the 1950s had ended in 1966 because the war is raging on in Vietnam. And most of society is under the age, demographically, of the age 25. A lot of young people in this country are afraid of having their number pulled to go to the Vietnam War. There are massive protests. And the most massive of this period was at the Pentagon that October. 100,000 people showed up. And this is what was Norman
Bill
Mailer.
was one of them,
Okay.
evidently, Tom.
No, that was me.
And Norman Mailer made it famous with the Armies of the Night.
Yeah.
And this is also where they tried to levitate the Pentagon because of all the psychedelic drugs they were taking at the time. And so there was this amazing youth culture. Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco becomes the epicenter of this cultural phenomenon. And it's a rejection of the 1950s values, the conformity, the conservatism. And people are trading in suits for tie-dye t-shirts. And they're rejecting what they feel is the over-materialism of American society. And these are kids from middle, upper classes. And so San Francisco's exploding. At the same time, culturally, everything is changing. There's this little film called The Graduate that's going to open that year, which mocks all middle-class conventions. And it's about a young college graduate from the East Coast who basically is having an affair with his father's partner's wife, Mrs. Robinson. And this is going to change Hollywood and films from henceforward. It's really kind of the first independent film in modern times. And it reflects the changing cultural mores of the period. At the same time, we have the Beatles. Now, the Beatles start off, A Hard Day's Night, I Want to Hold Your Hand. By 1967, they want to burn down your house, okay? And you have this great album, this historic album, Sgt. Pepper's, right? It comes out, and it is, no one had ever heard anything quite like it. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Everyone is trying to figure out what the heck John Lennon means by those lyrics. Well, he had taken a lot of LSD when he was writing that song. And, it was, the Beatles are still front and center in culture, but if you take a look at the Beatles in 67, say, comparison to 1963, long hair, mustaches, they have like this Eastern garb. They had stopped touring by 1967, and they had gone off with this Maharishi to India to try to find a new way of living and to revolutionize American life. And they eventually discovered that this guy was full of crap. And they said, well, he's only human, so, we'll go on to do our thing. But the Beatles were kind of, part of that changing environment. But if you look deeper at American society, the cleavages are just out of control. Martin Luther King is going to come out against the Vietnam War that April. And that's going to change everything. And basically, Martin Luther King's argument is, well, here we have, why are we having young white men and young black men? They're giving up their lives for a country that will not allow them to sit next to each other at a local school. He says the war was immoral. And the civil rights movement would never be the same. Johnson administration, Lyndon Johnson administration, the civil rights movement had been like this up to this point. Now, because of Martin Luther King's break with the Johnson administration over the war, they're going separate ways. At the same time, Martin Luther King is kind of being pushed aside in the civil rights movement because now we have the rise of the Black Power movement. And a lot of African Americans, justifiably so, are so frustrated because not enough progress has been made. Yes, the Voting Rights Act was passed. Yes, the Civil Rights Act was passed. But in terms of economic terms, socioeconomic terms, there's not full equality. So now we're seeing riots breaking out in most urban centers. Probably the most famous during the 1967 season was in Detroit. Detroit arguably has never recovered and probably played a role in why the Tigers, they really should have won the pennant that year. But everything was messed up. And the Tigers reflected it was a war zone in Detroit. They had to bring in army troops to quell the violence.
So, listening to you, Tom, in hearing how this was a transformational year in society and culture, but for me it begs a question, and Frank, because you were there, I think you could probably address this. How much did what was going on the outside seep into the clubhouse, or was it uninsulated from what was going on outside?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of it. You didn't hear a lot of talk about what was happening, the war raging in Vietnam, or the problems in Detroit. You heard very little of that stuff. There was total focus on what was going on the baseball field. There wasn't any reference to that.
There were 6 players on the team who actually were in the reserves. Right. Tony Canigliaro famously went up to Fort Drum. Lundborg went on his assignment to Atlanta, and a friendly pilot flew him back to Boston. He pitched, and he went home. And then in the middle of September, Bill Landis, who was a seldom used left-handed pitcher, was called into active duty. So he missed the entire World Series and the last 2 exciting weeks.
Bill, did you want to add something?
No, that was exactly what I was
that
going
what
to
you
talk
were
about,
gonna say?
Bill Landis
Yeah.
in particular.
So, that being the case, then let me ask you this. So Tom's kind of put the year in some context culturally. Tell us where the Red Sox were entering that 1967 season.
It was interesting for you to mention the Pentagon because I was there trying to get it to levitate. But I realized the time frame. This was just 2 weeks after the 1967 World Series. I was at the final game of the pennant when the Red Sox clinched, and I took a bus to the University of Chicago that evening. So I was in Chicago for the whole series. But 2 weeks later, I was down in Washington. I wasn't even against the war in Vietnam in particular at that point. I was kind of in the middle. But my two roommates were going down, so I went down, and it just all happened. But the Red Sox, on the other hand, who we're supposed to be talking about, they were in a doldrums. I mean, Ted Williams had retired in 1960. Earl Yastrzemski had come on as the next big star, but it took him a few years to become the next big star. It was really 67 that did it, though he didn't win a batting title in 63. The Red Sox had not had any. You need superstars sometimes, and the Red Sox had suffered from that. They'd also not done too well in the standings. In 1961, after Ted left, they were in 6th place. Next year, they were in 8th place, 7th place, 8th place. 65, they were in 9th place, and 66, the year before 67, they were in 9th place and only escaped being in the cellar by a half a game over the New York Yankees.
So in 66, Yawkey's doing interviews, Tom Yawkey, who owned the club since 1934, doing interviews, openly talking about possibly moving, selling the stadium. How legit were those? How serious do you think he was about that?
Will McDonough did an interview, the intrepid Will McDonough did an interview with Tom Yawkey, and Tom said, only a fool loses money year after year, and I'm no fool. And he said, if the state and the city don't build me a ballpark, I'm going to move this team. And he meant Oakland or Louisville. He didn't mean Foxborough.
And you think he was he using that strictly as a negotiating ploy, or do you think he meant it?
I think he was serious, yeah. He didn't say an awful lot that he wasn't serious about.
There was talk about multi-sport stadiums at that time,
Right.
combining with the Patriots and putting something out on maybe on 128 where there'd be more parking available. There were all kinds of plans, and a look for state subsidies. A couple of the governors at that time were, Volpe in particular, was in discussions about, they created a stadium authority to try to put things together. But the Red Sox, just one other thing, the Red Sox did struggle for fans too. I looked this up, from 1946 through 1960, they'd averaged over 1 million fans a year. But from 61 through 67, when they weren't, I mean, people getting tired of losing, they averaged 812,000. So it was a dramatic decrease. And opening day, 67, the park was 3/4 empty. They had, depending on which paper you read, there was some dyslexia going on among the typesetters or something. They had either 8,234 or 8,324. That means there were, all the rest of those 34,000 seats were empty.
So if any of you here, did anybody attend opening day in 1967? We don't believe you. There were only 8,000 people there.
Let us see the ticket stub.
Yeah.
I'm sorry? Cold, damp day, right?
Yeah.
Didn't you
They
actually
called
get
off
rained
the
out?
day
Yeah.
before.
Plus, it
Right.
cost $1 to buy a bleacher seat. This was not, this is an investment.
Yeah. Do you, sir, I mean, we're talking 50 years ago. I'll give you that much. Do you happen to remember who hit a 3-run home run for the Red Sox that day? No idea. Who said Rico?
Yeah.
We got a ringer in the house. Oh, damn spot. So we like to rhapsodize now, Frank, about how the Red Sox are always been a part of the fabric of New England life. I've used that line. If I haven't used it once, I've used it 1,000 times. But when you get that assignment in July of '67, I mean, were photographers fighting over each other for the chance to cover the Red Sox, or were they just another team at that time?
No, not at all. Clearly just another team. There was nobody was in a hurry to go to Fenway Park and cover another loss for the Red Sox. So, and an example of that is I was the junior member of the staff, and I was the guy they chose to do this job for the PM paper. And we had like 15 people on the staff, so that tells you how anxious they were to go to Fenway Park.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you just got a definition of lucky SOB right there.
Absolutely.
It's funny, the glamour team was the Bruins. We had this young defenseman by the name of Bobby Orr who was really turning heads at the time. And the Celtics, 67 was like the only year since like 1958 where they didn't win the championship because Wilt Chamberlain finally beat Bill Russell that year in the playoffs.
All right, so one of the, I guess really there's maybe two Richards that had an enormous impact on the Red Sox of '67. One was Dick O'Connell, who becomes the general manager of the ball club, and the other was this scrappy, young, aggressive manager who had managed the Toronto team, the Boston's AAA franchise, to the International League Championship the previous year, 1966, a guy by the name of Dick Williams. So many stories told about Dick Williams over the years. One of the best, Herb, I think you told me. Shoot.
Yeah, Gary Bell, and I don't have to explain to this group who Gary Bell was because you're so knowledgeable. But I asked Gary Bell about the relationship with Dick Williams, and he said we were the most united team in the history of baseball, united in our hatred of Dick Williams.
So Joe Madden, he wasn't. Is that so? Elaborate a little bit, all of you, on what you've learned about Dick Williams, and was his bite as bad as his bark, and did his players fear him? Did they? What was it? I mean, you already made it clear that at least a segment of the club hated him. I mean, one of the first things he did in spring training, he took away the captaincy from Carl Yastrzemski. How did that go over with the club?
Well, it was a big controversy. But you have to remember, in 1967, the average salary for a major leaguer was $7,000. So if the manager does not like you, you're screwed. And he had absolute control over the roster, though Yaz had leverage because Yawkey was very tight with him. So this was a predominantly, as you said, young roster. So they were all frightened just to keep their jobs. And I talked to Gary Bell as well. All the major players, in the winter, they would have to take on jobs, at a department store or an dealership, because just to make ends meet. And this is before the free agency era. Though it's interesting to point out, in '67, the major league players finally get together and they hire this new union organizer by the name of Marvin Miller. And in a matter of 10 years, he is going to revolutionize Major League Baseball and all professional sports with free agency. And so the leverage that Williams had was incredible, but also Williams, and I shouldn't say this, but he was a horrible human being. He was a womanizer. By the way, he tried to pick up my aunt, anyway, who was married at the time. He lived in Peabody on the North Shore, but he had a pretty messed up childhood. He grew up in St. Louis, and his father was an abuser. He used to drag him down to his basement if he felt he had done wrong, tie him to a pole, and whip him. And that's the kind of upbringing he had. And so he saw enemies everywhere. And in his screwed up psychology, it was him versus the world. And I think that's reflected in his managerial style.
Frank, you dealt with him on a daily basis. What did he strike you as?
I never had a problem with the man, but again, it was a different world for the photographers. The photographers had a way of getting along with the manager and the players and what have you, because we really weren't a threat to them in any way, shape, or form. But so I never had a problem with the guy, but I know the players.
But
Did-
The
Did he have his
players
defenders?
literally hated the guy.
Yeah. Did he have his defenders, Herb? Were there Williams guys?
Well,
Was there Williams?
Russ Gibson had been his playing coach in Toronto for 2 years, so he was probably as close to Williams as anybody. And they were going to put on a Russ Gibson Day at Fenway Park, the pride of Fall River, Mass. There are like 26 buses coming up from Fall River. And William said, I'm so mad at you, I'm not even going to start you on your day. And Russ told me, I said to Dick, there are some pretty tough guys on those buses. You might want to rethink that. And he was being sincere.
Bill, how about you in your research about Dick? And I don't know if you had opportunity over the years to interview him. I suspect. Oh, you never did.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
The two things that stick out aside from what folks have said here, in my memory is just one thing is that he had just been a player. Not that much, 63, 64. I mean, he was a player on the Red Sox, and here he was governing them, so to speak, just that shortly afterwards. And it's kind of a big transformation in responsibility. He's not one of the guys anymore. He's setting all the rules. The other one is his relationship with George Scott, which it's hard to pin down exactly what it was, but he was as insulting as you could possibly get in public about George Scott, calling him a cement head, telling him that he had to lose weight, and that was, I believe,
Didn't he say
more motivational. He thought it was motivational.
Didn't
and
he
it
say
probably
that
was a
talking
little
to
bit.
Scott was like talking to a wall?
Yeah,
To
yeah.
cement.
Yes.
And I interviewed him, Dick Williams, that is about 15 years ago, and one of the things he said was, I wish I hadn't said that.
Yeah.
He said, that was just over the top, and I regret it.
You may have been present when they were inducted. Weren't Dick and George Scott inducted in the Red Sox Hall of Fame at the same time?
year. That's
And I
right.
believe, maybe I'm giving Dick too much credit, but did he go up and apologize to Scott, or at least say, I wish I hadn't said that?
Yeah, I can almost see them in my mind's eye sitting on the sofa and obviously having a nice heart-to-heart sort of talk.
Yeah.
Exactly what they said, I don't know. But Dick did emphasize in my interview, he wished he hadn't said it that way.
So I also had mentioned Dick O'Connell. I mean, Dick O'Connell, who actually came over to the baseball side from the business side, correct? He was a business manager for years. The Red Sox front office management, I can safely describe as being woefully incompetent, frequently drunk,
Dysfunctional.
and not to mention had blinders on when it came to maybe signing African American players.
Well, the Bruins integrated before the Red Sox did.
Yeah, that's all you need to know, right? But tell me a little bit about Dick O'Connell and what made him so effective in that role and how he won Tom Yawkey's trust.
Well, as you mentioned, he had been with the organization, but not on the baseball side. 20 years as the business guy. And Yawkey named him GM in 1965, September 1965. And at his press conference, Dick O'Connell said, I don't care what color a player is, if he's going to help the team, we're going to go out and get him. And if you think ahead to 1967, you could walk into the ballpark and there's John Wyatt on the mound, Elston Howard behind the plate, George Scott on first, Joe Foy at third base, Reggie Smith center field, maybe Jose Tartable in right field. So overnight they went from virtually no players of color to some real contributors.
So perhaps it's not a mere coincidence that, given the fact that they had African American players who could play,
But
they won in 1967?
the Yankees were almost as bad, and it finally caught up with the Yankees in 1965 and forward. But Elston Howard was the first player that they had signed. It was quite a while before they signed a second African American player.
Yeah, the Red Sox famously were the last major league team to have an African American, Pumpsie Green, on the team, 1959, which was 12 years after Jackie Robinson and a couple years after Jackie Robinson retired. There had been any number of MVPs when Jackie Robinson won the MVP, it was only for all of baseball. Then they had separate ones for each league. But there'd been any number of star players that had come forward. The Red Sox just never made any movement. Howard Bryant, who is a sports writer from the area, happens to be of African-American descent. He took down a quote he wrote in his book, Shut Out, which is a good book on Red Sox and race in the Boston area here. He said, "To me, Dick O'Connell is the most underrated person in Red Sox history. He was the first Red Sox executive to look at the club and make baseball decisions and not crony decisions. It's Dick Johnson of the Sports Museum that came up with the phrase Crony Island that defined the Red Sox administration of that period." And I came across a quote that Mike Andrews said, too. He said that Joe Foy was the first black person I was ever close to, and soon he was my best friend. He was more than baseball. He was so special. You won't find anybody who doesn't feel strongly about Joe Foy, the person. And he talked about how the struggles that Joe Foy and some of the other black players, Reggie Smith and George Scott, faced. Earl Wilson had been in headlines in '66 because he had been denied entry to a nightclub in Winter Haven. He'd gone in with Dennis Bennett and another player, and they were, the N-word came out, and they said, so all the three players just left. But it was a front page headline in Boston for a while. But Mike Andrews said we'd be in a little town in Florida, and when we'd be done for the day, we'd have to drive to the other side of town and leave them off at one of those houses sitting on blocks because they weren't allowed to stay at the same hotel as the Red Sox team. These were obstacles they had to overcome, for sure.
And you have to remember, too, Dick O'Connell was part of the greatest generation. His formative years was during World War II. He was an intelligence officer in the Pacific Theater, served under Admiral Nimitz. You have to remember, before World War II in the Depression, he grew up, not in great circumstances in the Depression. They went off together in the war, and they encouraged, for the first time they meet people of different cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic, and also people of color. And I think that was a formative experience for him. Basically found out, here we are, we're going to win the war, but we have to win. Everyone has to pull together. All creeds, all colors. And I think that really influenced him moving forward. And he took it into his business management and into the Red Sox. And remember, the Red Sox were kind of an old, crusty organization. The guy who had been running it for so long had been Joe Cronin, who basically was arch enemies to Jackie Robinson. I mean, Robinson tried out with the Red Sox, and Red Sox could have been the first team to integrate, but Joe Cronin wouldn't give him the time of day. And Cronin was an complete incompetent. When he first saw Carl Yastrzemski, he said, "Is this the kid that's going to be great? Shouldn't he be bigger?" He was demeaning Carl Yastrzemski. But the difference with O'Connell was not that he was necessarily a great GM. He was the first competent GM in a very long time that the Red Sox had.
The first non-drinking buddy of Tom Yawkey.
Exactly, exactly.
The whole Earl Wilson episode raises what to me is a great what-if question. So Red Sox management had essentially asked Wilson to keep that incident under wraps. They didn't want it to end up in the papers. Well, Earl Wilson wasn't wired that way. Nobody was going to tell Earl Wilson what he could or couldn't say. So he does an interview, I believe it was with Willie McDonough in the Globe. And so the story's out there, and it caused some measure of embarrassment for the Red Sox and all. And later that summer, I believe it was in June, the Red Sox traded Earl Wilson to the Detroit Tigers for essentially a bag of balls. And I hope there aren't any relatives of Don Demeter here, but he was the outfielder who actually had a decent career, but he was clearly at the tail end of his career. So we get to 1967. Earl Wilson, pitching for the Detroit Tigers, wins 22 games. 22 games, matching Jim Lomborg, which gets me to my what-if question. So if we had kept Earl Wilson, might we have had enough pitching to win Game 7 of the World Series instead of running Jim Lomborg out on 2 days rest? So, yes, Frank.
I have a quick George Scott story. In spring training in Winter Haven, there was one motel, one restaurant, and one ballpark. That was it, folks, believe me. And occasionally in the morning, I would walk from the motel to the ballpark. And once in a while, I would walk with George. And on our walk, we would pass these tar paper shacks with the people of color sitting on the porches, just totally destitute. They didn't have anything, believe me. One day I looked at him, and there's tears rolling down his face. He was embarrassed. You know, he felt so bad for those people, and knowing that he was doing pretty well financially, you know, I look at him and there's tears literally rolling down his face. And as far as that nightclub goes in Winter Haven, I was famously banned from that place for my.
All right.
That's another
Oh,
story.
I told them what I thought about them. It was an organization. It wasn't a nightclub. It was an organization like, you know, I'm not going to say which one it was, but it was an organization. But it was the only place in town to get a decent meal. There were two places, the one restaurant and this place, this club. And I managed to get myself barred from there, which I was very, very proud of.
So, you know, many of us, certainly in recent years, we've grown up with the idiots and Johnny Damon doing his naked pull-ups and Kevin Millard cowboying up and some real characters. Who was the character on the '67 team?
Well, the funniest guy was George Thomas,
Oh.
but Gary Bell would have a big argument
dong.
with him.
Ding Dong Bell.
Between the two of them. But a lot of the players told me things would get very, very tight with Williams. You know, everybody's tense. Nobody wants to take a chance. And George Thomas would say something funny, lighten the mood, and, you know, very strategically. He's a funny man.
And Dick Williams said, "You're as funny on the field as you are off it, Thomas."
Coming here today, running into a gentleman told me a great George Thomas story. I had never heard this phrase. I guess George Thomas would go to management and say, bench me or trade me. Think about that one a little bit. So we get to July, we get to the All-Star break. The Red Sox are still 5.5 games back. Now, were you already with the club at that time?
Just about starting.
Okay,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
about starting.
They were 5 games back, I think, when I
Yeah.
started.
So they go off on the road trip where they win 10 games in a row. And Frank famously, and I want to ask you this, were you on the flight? How is it? I'm jumping ahead of myself. Famously, Frank captures the scene at Logan Airport. In the middle of a Sunday night, there are over 10,000 people at Logan Airport to greet the Red Sox coming back from this 10-game winning streak.
No, I wasn't on that trip.
So how'd you...
That picture at Logan Airport, where you see them all picking up their baggage at the carousel, which is really kind of weird when you think about it today. They don't know what a bag is. I mean, they don't need to. But no, that was the picture at the carousel at Logan Airport is we came back from a short trip to Washington, D.C. over Labor Day to play the Senators. And that was, we were coming back from that.
The picture at the... that was...
The picture of the fans at Logan Airport.
Yeah.
I was not on that trip, but I was there when they
You
came
were
back.
there. So did you get... I'm just curious how you ended up being at Logan. Did you get advance word that there were going to be a lot of people there? Did it come over on the police scanner? How is it that you were there? Do you have any blessed idea?
No, we covered every move they made at that point.
Okay.
You know, I mean, we were there. Wherever they were, we were there. And that's the reason I was there at that time, but that was not the time they were picking up their baggage.
Can we take a quick poll? How many of you were at Logan Airport that night? Come on. This girl, this guy was working. They have no excuse.
So
I'm
how
glad
is it
I
that
went.
you were there, Herb?
Well, just spontaneous, like the other 10,000 people, you know.
Yeah.
It was long before social media.
Yeah.
People weren't tweeting, sending emails about, you heard the announcement. As a courtesy, at the end of the game, they would make an announcement for the wives and the families and the friends. And when they made the announcement, Bill Crowley, the public relations director, said, "Boy, I'm not sure this could be a problem." So he called the state police at Logan Airport and said, "You'd better be prepared for a mob scene to welcome the Red Sox home." And they laughed at him. A mob to meet the Red Sox. They said, we took care of the Beatles, presidents. We're not really concerned.
But one thing that strikes me about that scene that I think would be so different today is, if I'm guessing that if there were 15,000 people waiting at Fenway for the current club to come home, they'd find a way to have buses meet them out on the tarmac, take them out a back way, and nobody was.
Yeah.
But this club, what was their reaction when they found out that the fans were there?
Well, they told me first they didn't believe it because usually there were, a couple of kids and wives and, people that yell at them. Somebody said there are 10,000 people waiting for him. And then they ended up putting him on a bus to take him over to the terminal. And at some point, the crowd surrounded the bus and started rocking the bus. And somebody said, hey, let's give him Koenig as an offering, and maybe they'll let us go.
You mentioned Tony Conigliaro, and we really should spend a little time talking about these, two dominant players on that roster. And I mean, you could certainly throw Jim Lomborg into that mix. Lomborg having won the Cy Young Award that season, winning 22 games. But here you have the local hero, Tony Conigliaro, kid from the North Shore, East Boston, Swampscott, St. Mary's. First pitch he sees at Fenway Park was, did I get it right? Is it St. Mary's or Lynn Classical?
St.
It
Mary's.
is. I figured if there was somebody from Lynn, I would have heard about it. But first pitch he sees in Fenway Park, hits a home run. He's the fastest player in American League history to hit 100 home runs. And then there's Captain Carl, the guy who succeeds Ted Williams, a Hall of Famer, in left field, wins a batting championship in 1963, but hasn't exactly captured the imagination of Sox fans. He's a good player, but he's hardly a great player. Then he has a season for the ages in '67. I asked first that you gentlemen address what you know of the nature of the relationship between Tony C. and Yaz, and then let's talk about that night, August 18th, when Tony gets beamed.
I wasn't there that night. I believe it or not, I was off. Kind of happy about that in a way. Tony was kind of a friend of mine, and that was a pretty sad night for everybody. But as far as his relationship with Yaz goes, there were not many people in that clubhouse that had a strong relationship with Yaz. The first person to ever have a strong relationship with Yaz in the clubhouse was Louis Tiant, because Louis wasn't afraid of him. And Louis would say things that I cannot say right now to him, loud for everybody in the clubhouse to hear. And everybody in the clubhouse would go, oh my God, he's, can't say that to Yaz. Yeah, I can, But as far as being tight with anybody on the '67 team, Mike Andrews maybe, but that would be the extent of what I saw.
Yeah.
Well, he was a loner. I mean, he was considered.
He being Yaz.
Yes, and in 1967, entering the season, there was a lot of trade talk that the Dodgers supposedly were interested in him, but he was considered a dog. I mean, he had been suspended several times. Johnny Pesky, who was, can we all agree, Saint Johnny Pesky? He suspended him for loafing on the bases. He kind of threw up his hands. He showed up in spring training one year, 20 pounds overweight. Can you imagine if Hanley Ramirez showed up at 20 pounds overweight at spring training?
Wait a second, Tom. Haven't you seen Pablo Sandoval?
Well, I know, that's true. That's true. Fair enough. But I mean, Pablo Yaz was supposed to be the leader. But what happens is in the off season, going into '67, he hooks up with this trainer in Linfield. Was it Gene Beard?
Yes.
And he gets him in awesome shape. And this is the first real, season where he really took his conditioning seriously. And it showed in the power numbers in '67 what he was able to accomplish. But up to that point, Yaz was considered, he's a decent ball player, but you don't want him on your roster. He's a troublemaker. He's a locker room lawyer type. '67 forever changed everyone's image of Yaz. But in terms of his relationship with Tony C., there was a rivalry there. There was a competition. They were not close at all. And later on, after '67, when Billy Conigliaro was promoted to the Major League roster, there was a lot of infighting. Conigliaros did not like Yastrzemski.
Right, and certainly their lifestyles are 180 degrees opposite. And that was a factor. But the teammates said that there was a mutual respect as far as their abilities to hit the ball. And
So
and
if you're
hit
going
it
to talk
well.
about lifestyle, how many of you owned a Tony C 45? Anybody? Yeah, all right.
Little Red
You still have it.
Do you? Yeah. Do you? Long gone. Long gone. All right. Miss, I saw you raise your hand. Did Tony C legitimately qualify as a quote heartthrob in 1967?
And he knew it.
Sure did. Well, I just want to say there's one anecdote. I interviewed Tim McCarver for my book, and the first game of the World Series was at Fenway that year. And Yaz, I think he was hitless in that first game. And instead of like kind of sulking in the locker room and just kind of feeling sorry for himself, right after the game, he took extra batting practice. And the Cardinals, I was talking to Kim McCarver, who's the all-star catcher for the Cardinals. The Cardinals were waiting for the bus to go to their hotel here. And they're watching Yaz, along with, I think it was with Petrocelli and Harrelson, taking batting practice, particularly Yaz. And they were amazed. They just played a World Series game, and they're working out pretty intensely. And I asked McCarver, what were you thinking at the time about, especially Yaz? And he just says one word, respect.
Yeah.
And that says it all about Yaz that particular year. He didn't get that before 1967.
Just one footnote for the Yaz story. On May 14th, Mother's Day, and the calendar is identical this year, in case you're in the calendar.
Clearly you are, Herb.
Yeah, really. At that point, they were 11 and 14, so they're, I think, in 6th, 7th place. And Yaz was hitting 282 with 2 home runs. So think about it, 25 games, 2 home runs. He's going to hit his 16 or 18 home runs and bat 290 maybe. And he and Bobby Doerr went in early to have extra batting practice at Fenway well before the game. And when they were all through, Bobby Doerr said, why don't you try holding your hands a little higher? And if you close your eyes, you can almost picture Yaz. And Yaz told me that he got more power. He was able to leverage it and use all that good conditioning. And from there on, obviously, he hit 42 home runs.
And you have to remember, too, after Tony C was out of the lineup, he was a crucial part of the power in that lineup. Yaz deliberately went for more home runs because he was like the major source of power on the team. So he might not have made 40 home runs, but he felt he had to for the team to win the pennant that year after Canigliaro went down.
Yaz, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but he unintentionally ruined the careers of more little leaguers and put one in the seats. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And I mean, the numbers bear a good deal of this out. I mean, the last couple weeks of the season, where every game mattered. You have 4 teams coming down in the closest race in American League history. Yaz, in those last 2 weeks, hits 544, 23 for 44. And the last weekend of the season against the Minnesota Twins, the Sox have to win both games just to even hope for a tie. Yaz goes 7 for 8. I mean, that's just unbelievable to me. But my question for you, Frank, is, okay, I know how it looked like through the prism of the kid's eyes. What did it feel like for the guys in that clubhouse? I mean, were they in awe of what they were watching and seeing just as much as we were at home listening on our transit?
Yeah, they were. It was really hard to tell because the atmosphere in the clubhouse around Yaz was totally different than it was around the rest of the place. Yaz was, he had his locker and his cigarettes and his beer. And you kind of didn't go into that space, so it's hard to tell how the other players felt about him or anything. But yeah, they were in awe of him, obviously. Yeah. I mean, we all were. And as from a photographer's point of view, every time he came to the plate, it was like high alert. I mean, absolutely high. You never knew what was going to happen. You pretty much sure it was going to be something good.
Whenever I've had the opportunity to interview a baseball lifer like Don Zimmer, Ralph Houck, some years around the game 50, I always say to them, did you ever see anybody have a better year than Yaz in 1967? And the answer is always similar, not when every game mattered.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing to remember here is, because we're 2017, I review the games from '67 season. I'm amazed. Why were they pitching to Yaz, particularly down the stretch? Now with all the analytic guys, the sabermetrics, there's no way Yaz could have duplicated. They would just pitch around. They would have walked him every time. And that's, in a way, what's wrong with the game today. Apart from the fact that they could get a game in under 2 hours back in 1967.
Every one of the World Series games was played in less. Only one game went longer than 2.5 hours.
Wow.
Only one game in the World Series. That only went to 2:48.
So this morning, I tweeted out that this event was taking place, right? And some guy tweeted back to me, said, "Didn't they lose?" Like, what's the point? So, before I open the floor to questions, I'd like each one of you, and we'll start at the other end. We'll start with you, Bill. Put into perspective why in your view, where does 1967 rank in that arc of Red Sox history?
I think we've got a World Series trophy over here. It just took 37 more years to get it. Thank you for bringing it. And but many people say that was the beginning of Red Sox Nation. I talked about the attendance figures before. I looked at the Boston Globe, the morning edition, to study coverage of the Red Sox. And in all of '66, there were 15 front page stories for the whole year. By the time the Impossible Dream seemed to become possible, in August alone, there were 13 front page stories. And as September progressed, they pretty much took over the front page. It was just, it was a phenomenon. And you couldn't get, it was difficult to get into the ballpark for the first time in ages. And we've seen an explosion of interest that really has never died. They've tried a couple times, but couldn't kill the fandom. I mean, it just really took over. And they did lose. That's true, but it almost didn't feel that way because the real race, I mean, as you said, it was the single greatest race in baseball, Major League Baseball history. To have 4 teams that were in the race till the very last few days. It's never happened since, and the Red Sox came out on top. From that point on, it was kind of anticlimactic.
Herb?
Well, I think back to the spring of 1967 and the Red Sox report in Winter Haven. Literally, nobody really cared. If you had said to somebody, "Has the equipment truck left yet?" They'd say, "What's an equipment truck?" And yet, this is fundamentally a very, very good baseball city. People love baseball played well. This is the 147th consecutive year that we have had a professional team in Boston, and that's more than any other city. Yeah.
Who knew? Yeah.
Me.
Frankie, you lived it.
Yeah, as a photographer, I didn't have a beat, so to speak. I covered all the sports. So I covered Bruins, the Celtics, the Patriots, and the Red Sox. And I covered them during the glory years for a lot of those teams. And nothing compared to the 1967 Red Sox. I mean, the Bruins in '69 and '70 were spectacular. The Red Sox in 2004, and of course, all of the Celtics championship runs were a lot of fun. But nothing compares to the 1967 Red Sox.
Right.
Tom?
Well, I guess you could just say it's the birth of Red Sox Nation, that it was the year where the Red Sox finally mattered. I mean, remember, as we were talking before, there was a lot of talk about them moving out of town, especially rumors about Milwaukee, of all places. And, they turned it around. And, before 1967, we didn't hear about a curse of the Bambino. That was only fabricated several years later. I mean, and really, since '67, the attendance exploded. And remember, too, Boston used to be a 2-baseball team town. But after 1952, when the Braves left, it was just the Red Sox, and they blew it. But '67, it just touched a chord that brought even the former National League fans over to the American League side. And I think of the Red Sox that year, the most famous second place team next to the 1951 New York Giants of Bobby Thompson.
I will also mention that, as you see before you, is the trophy from the 2004 World Series. Originally, we were supposed to have all three, but Sam Kennedy put in a request for two of them, and Sammy outranks me a little bit. So I want to thank Peter, Gavin, all the folks from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Fred, you don't skate. You don't skate. This gentleman right here, please stand up, sir. So this gentleman comes over and meets with myself and our curator, Sarah Coffin. He's preparing a paper that he's going to give to a men's group, a presentation to a men's group. And he wanted our advice, all right? So we said, well, what are you planning to do your paper on? He goes, well, I was thinking the history of the Red Sox. So he shows us what he's got, and he's up to like about 1912. And I said, Fred, you're like 45 minutes into this presentation. This is going to be longer than Nicholas Nickleby on Broadway, which was 8.5 hours, you know? So it was out of that meeting that the inspiration for this whole event came. Fred's very much involved here. You're on the board here. Suggested, hey, you know, maybe you ought to come over to the Historical Society. And that was the origins of this. And I can't tell you how humbled and gratified we are to be in such a beautiful place. I mean, I love Fenway, of course, but this is kind of a step up in class. So I urge you, I mean, you, even just spending the short time you have here today, you can see there's some pretty cool stuff in this place, in addition to Frank's tremendous photographs. So I urge you to come back. And this is kind of an undiscovered jewel a little bit in Boston. But in addition to the three authors here, Tom, Bill, Herb, as you noted, sir, they were tremendous. But I do want to pay one final time special tribute to the gentleman in that blue polo shirt, my buddy from the Ponce, Frank O'Brien. All right, and please take the opportunity, if you haven't before. That's a special piece of hardware that the Red Sox, we thank you so much for bringing it over on. Thank you again for your attention. This has been fun.